Arc Worlds Publishing presents Guild of Tokens, Relic Hunter. Introduction to Relic Hunter. Relic Hunter takes place 9 years prior to the events of Guild of Tokens, 7 years prior to the events of Trainee, and 3 years prior to the events of Enforcer. The tour guide was late. Ordinarily, Beatrice Taylor wouldn't have cared. She wasn't one of those people who planned their vacation down to the millisecond, who visited a dozen different places in a day just to snap a picture before heading off to the next attraction. And this trip to Corfu had been no exception, at least for the first week. Beatrice had arrived the previous Thursday evening, tired from a day spent running through several airports, eating horrible airplane food, and waiting several hours for a rickety bus to show up to take her to the hotel. But all that travel angst had been washed away by the rays of the morning sun, reflecting off of the blue waters of Corfu Bay. She had spent most of that first day lounging on the deck of her palatial suite, enjoying the view and the breeze off the crystal blue waves. And the next day. In fact, she hadn't done much of anything the entire weekend. That was perfectly fine, though. She had given herself the entire month to accomplish her task here in Corfu, and if she front-loaded her R&R, so be it. On Monday morning, she had finally begun her reconnaissance, slowly moving outward from the hotel, a little bit more each day. The island was large, as far as Greek islands went, nearly 3 times the size of Santorini, which she had visited once on spring break in college. It also had a plethora of historical sites, which would have been great if she were here purely on a sightseeing trip and not trying to track down an ancient weapon of unimaginable power. And so that was why Beatrice had enlisted the services of a multitude of tour guides over the course of the next 2 weeks, sometimes 2 or 3 in one day. There were too many leads to track down on her own, even if she stayed a second month. At the same time, though, she didn't want to be at the mercy of a single guide's knowledge, which had necessitated visiting each site at least twice. Beatrice took a final long sip of her coffee and set the mug down on the bar. The hotel restaurant was still relatively empty this early in the morning, and she tried to savor the beauty of the view just outside before another day of fruitless touring. Except there was someone now occupying the stool directly to her right. The woman was dressed in the typical tour guide costume, a light long-sleeve white blouse, a blue backpack slung around her shoulders, and dusty sneakers. Except this one had somehow forgotten that shorts were not an acceptable garment choice on the continent, even if they were technically on an island. "Molly?" said the woman in a chipper voice, and in unaccented English. "Yep, that's me," said Beatrice, who had adopted a different pseudonym with each guide. "And you are?" Leah Palace." The guide extended her hand, and Beatrice shook it, her palm pressing sharply against the many colorful rings adorning Leah's fingers. She took a moment to survey today's guide. Leah had curly brown hair that spilled forth from underneath a faded white hat and down the back of her neck. Her skin was a healthy bronze, no doubt from the days spent touring around the island, and her neck was adorned with several gold chains that descended into her blouse. "Nice to meet you, Molly. I hope you're ready for some walking. There's a lot to cover in the old city, and I want to get us up to the Venetian fortress before it gets too hot." "Sounds good to me," said Beatrice, who suppressed a frown at the guide's lack of any noticeable accent. It's not that she wanted a born-and-bred Corfiot to show her around. She would be fine with someone from the mainland or one of the other islands, but the thought of wasting a day strolling around the cobblestoned streets of old Corfu with an expat from the West Coast was beyond the pale. They exited the hotel to find a black sedan parked outside, the driver leaning against the passenger side door smoking a cigarette. Leah nodded to the man, who flicked the half-finished butt onto the street and reluctantly opened the door for them. As the car sped down the coastal highway towards the city, Beatrice decided to press for more information about her American guide. "You're not from here, are you?" "I'm sorry, I don't mean to be rude, but what gave it away?" said Leah with a wry smile. "Most of the time I talk like that, but you seemed like someone who's used to bullshit, so I dispensed with the fakery." Well, I appreciate the honesty. How long have you been in Corfu? For a few years now, but my family has deep roots here. Used to come here a lot in my youth. Although, to be honest, I prefer Cassos. I'll have to check that out on my next trip. Beatrice squinted through the high noon sun at the old city below her as beads of sweat trickled down her face. The buildings were purposefully built to maximize their number, given the extensive fortifications that had previously encircled the town. It made for winding, cobblestone-filled roads threaded between beautiful but old Venetian-style houses left over from when the island had been a province of the City of Canals, and it would have all been very impressive to Beatrice if she had not already been through the city 2 times. "Quite a view, huh?" said Leah, who offered Beatrice her canteen. She accepted and proceeded to greedily gulp down the citrus-flavored water. The guide frowned at her as she handed back the almost empty vessel, and Beatrice offered a quick apology. "Sorry, didn't realize I was so thirsty," she said. "No, it wasn't that," said Leah. "You've already been here, haven't you?" Beatrice stood straight up and tried to keep her features calm. Her mind raced in 100 different directions, but she settled on a simple cover. "You got me. Was here the other day with another guide. Bit of a history buff, so I wanted to get a second walk through the city," she said with a smile. It's not like it was against the law to tour twice, and there was no way that the guide knew her true purpose. "You're looking for something," stated Leah matter-of-factly. "I'm sorry, what? I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not looking for the Medoblad. But don't worry, I'll help you find it." In the dusty basement of a dusty library, on a dusty shelf, there was a book. It wasn't a particularly noteworthy book. It had pages, as most books tended to have, and a cover, one that opened and everything. To the ordinary observer, and there were few because, as it was, this book was in a not very well-trafficked corner of this particular library, it was just an old book on a shelf, indistinguishable from any of the books to its left and its right. But to Beatrice Stollard, it was more than a book with crinkly pages and a worn cover. It was a book that had changed her life. Before she had discovered it, she had been like almost every other quester, grinding out laborious tasks for a pittance of tokens. Then, one day, she received a random message in her Q-mail inbox with an even randomer string of numbers that turned out to be the call number for said book. It had taken entirely too long for her to find the tome, but once she had, nothing was ever the same again. That book was a diary, written by a woman named Rita Von Ash. Beatrice had devoured Rita's daily recollections of New York and its surrounding environs circa 1777. It was a momentous time for the fledgling nation, and for Rita too, as the guild she had steered through many tumultuous years was facing its biggest challenge yet. The historical accounts were interesting enough to Beatrice, but the real value of the diary was its musings on alchemy. Alchemy was the science of magic, which was actually real, as the diary had divulged. Once Beatrice had gotten over that shock to her system, she realized that thanks to her chemical engineering degree, she was particularly well-suited for developing new alchemic creations. The diary provided a good basis on ingredients and theory, but it had taken a lot of experimentation, a lot of wading into smelly swamps and wild forests, and of course, a lot of harvesting organs from pigeons and rats, for her to get where she was now. Those latter tasks were a necessary evil, as vermin were excellent carriers of prima materia, the unfiltered raw material of alchemy, because of their status as the most well-traveled species on Earth. The amount of prima materia one could extract from a pigeon or rat was small, but it was the closest thing to a constant that Beatrice had come across in alchemy. The culmination of her alchemic research to date were several small squares that looked like ordinary gummies you might find in a random jar in a candy store, except that the green one, when eaten, imbued the ingester with preternatural focus. The effect had certainly helped Beatrice refine and perfect her recipe for that flavor, and the low-level strength gummy, or buff, as she called it, although there were several weekend-long benders that she would have liked to forget. Maybe after she perfected the memory-erasing serum she was also dabbling with. Today's task, though, was the beginning of a new project, and it had coincidentally brought Beatrice back to the library where she had first found Rita's diary. Of course, she hadn't bothered to return the diary after her initial borrow. That would have been the equivalent of giving back the Rosetta Stone, and Beatrice wasn't that stupid. Also, she had applied for a library card under a fake name, so there was no risk of the book cops coming after her. The third floor of the Seward Park Library was seemingly empty when she arrived, and Beatrice set her backpack down at one of the tables before pulling out one of the green squares from her pocket. She undid the plastic wrapping, held her nose shut with her fingers, and popped the gummy into her mouth. The taste left something to be desired, but Beatrice powered through and counted down the seconds until the buff initialized. That was always the hardest part, the waiting. The buff turned her ordinarily driven self into a maniacally focused crazy person who would easily forget to eat and sleep and perform other necessary bodily functions until the effects wore off. And after that happened, when her mind had tumbled back down into its normal state, the whole experience always felt like she was remembering an old spaghetti western she watched late at night on her mom's black and white TV. The buff activated without Beatrice feeling it. It was an improvement over the previous times when she had felt like her head had been placed into an ever-tightening vice, but at least that had been a good signal. This go-around, it took Beatrice several minutes before she realized that she had been intently staring at the library table, trying to determine what type of wood it was made of. Her brain would have continued down that path until the buff eventually wore off, had she not noticed her backpack sitting still unopened on the far end of the table. Beatrice slowly got to her feet, careful not to let her vision fixate on something else, and walked to the book-filled bag. She freed its contents and laid out the volumes she had tracked down from used bookstores, estate sales, and even one from a coffee shop lending library. These were just the stepping stones, the first notes of the symphony she was writing. The rest of the knowledge she needed was somewhere in the sea of books surrounding her. It might have taken her years to track down the right snippets and cross-references and random handwritten notes hidden on the dozens of shelves, but thanks to the buff, today would be the day she finally discovered the location of the Medoblad. Beatrice stared out the window as the black sedan made its way down the coastal road. This day was turning into an outright disaster, and not even the gorgeous blue waters could make her feel anything but a sense of hopelessness. All those weeks of planning after she had uncovered the location of the Medoblad, and she had still managed to make a complete jackass of herself in the span of a few hours. Beatrice had briefly considered making a run for it when the car had come to a halt at the last traffic light, but thought better of it and decided to at least wait until they had reached their destination. After about 10 more minutes of awkward silence, the car finally pulled off of the narrow road and onto a patch of grass opposite a large green expanse bounded by a metal gate. Before Beatrice could open the door to step out, Leah said something in Greek to the driver, and he exited the car. "So," said Leah, turning to Beatrice, "you going to sulk like a teenager who got caught out past curfew, or do you actually want my help?" "Who are you?" said Beatrice. "I'm Leah. We've been through that, and you're Beatrice Smith." Smith obviously wasn't her last name, just the boring pseudonym she had come up with years ago when she didn't want to particularly stand out. But the fact that Leah had teased that out worried her nonetheless. "No, you must have me confused with someone else. I told you my name was Molly." "Yes, I know that's what you told me, but I also know that a blonde American woman has been going on tours for the past 2 weeks, asking peculiar questions, going to the same sites over and over, and to each guide she's given a different name." "And?" said Beatrice, not wanting to give an inch. "And we're not idiots. All the guides talk. Maybe if you had a bunch of wigs or could wipe our memories or something, then it might have been a different story. Beatrice froze. She did in fact have a serum that, when imbibed, erased the last several minutes of the subject's memory. There were several vials of it buried in her suitcase, along with a bag of the focus buffs, one of the stronger strength buffs she hadn't yet perfected, and a second version of the memory serum. That one still needed work. It was designed to selectively remove a particular event or person from someone's memory, but sometimes it made you just pass out and wake up with the memory still intact. And other times it would heighten recollection of the memory, which obviously wasn't very helpful. But her boyfriend Garrett had been a good, if unknowing, subject, and Beatrice was certain that another few rounds of refinements would do the trick. Fine, you're right. In retrospect, it was a bit foolish, but you still didn't explain how you know my name, or how you even know about the Medoblad. Leah smiled. Oh, that first part was easy. I just flashed the guy at the front desk a €10 note and a smile. You'll have a nice fruit basket waiting for you in your room when you get back tonight, by the way. As for the second part, let's just say that I keep an eye out for up-and-coming questers. And as much as you're trying to stay under the radar, you've been doing a terrible job so far. Now let's get going. The Temple of Artemis hadn't been a temple for more than 1,000 years, but although all that remained of it were several clusters of stone and a dissembled altar, to Beatrice it was still impressive. After all, she couldn't think of anything that she had created that would even be around in 20 years, and yet these ruins still stood in the green field. Of course, the impact was lessened by the fact that she had already been here 3 times, but she hoped that this visit would be more fruitful. Can I dispense with the formalities, or do you want to learn about how the temple was the first Doric temple built exclusively out of stone? Said Leah, opening the metal gate at the front of the complex. You can skip the history lesson, I've heard it already. Unless you have something new to add? I do. Do you know why we're here? Asked Leah, who hustled down the raised wooden plank path that ran along the edge of the ruins. Beatrice broke into a slight jog to catch up, and they soon reached the end. Well, I know why I went to the museum up by the fortress. It's where they keep the surviving pediment of the temple. It would have stood above here, right? Said Beatrice, pointing to the row of stones just to their left. Yes, and I'm sure it wasn't lost on you why that pediment is important. Beatrice rolled her eyes. She felt like she was back in elementary school being lectured by a patronizing teacher. But she humored the guide for now, if it meant learning something that would aid in her search. It depicts Medusa, quite magnificently in my opinion. Yes. It's not a coincidence that the Medoblad is hidden somewhere in Corfu, which has the only temple in Greece depicting the Gorgon herself. My thoughts exactly, said Beatrice. But don't tell me that the blade is just buried somewhere in this field. That would be disappointing. It's not. Which is a good thing, too, because Kaiser Wilhelm had a particularly strong affinity for the pediment. He was the one who excavated the temple 100 years ago. Can you imagine what would have happened if he had found the blade here? Fortunately, someone beat him to the punch by about 300 years. How do you know that? Follow me, said Leah, and she stepped off of the wooden plank and began walking across the grass back toward the entrance. Beatrice glanced around, waiting for a nun from the nearby monastery to appear and scold them harshly for straying from the literal and figurative path. But evidently they were all occupied with other tasks, and so she followed the guide, who had already made her way back to the front of the enclosure, where a rectangular arrangement of stones that stood about 3 feet high and extended toward one of the monastery buildings awaited. Without warning, Leah gingerly vaulted over the stones and set herself down in the structure's interior, which descended below the ground. Beatrice was now certain they were only moments away from being attacked by a horde of angry nuns. But after a minute of awkward silence, no such mob had emerged. Come on, said Leah, before the afternoon tour buses start arriving. Okay, said Beatrice. She tried to follow the guide's precise footwork, but hadn't counted on there being a lower lip of stones at the bottom of the enclosure, and nearly smashed her head trying to avoid them before Leah righted her. "So, now that we are both desecrating this thousands-year-old ruin, can you tell me what the hell any of this has to do with the Medoblad?" "Gladly," said Leah. "This was an altar that stood outside the temple when it was still intact. The Medoblad was used here for various ceremonies, and it doesn't take much to imagine how those must have gone. Then, the temple was destroyed, the remains buried, and of course the keepers of the Medoblad didn't have the good sense to take it with them when they fled, so there it was left. Until the daughter of the Castellan of the Angelo Castro sought the blade during the Ottoman siege of 1537, and single-handedly turned the tide against the invaders." "And how did she do that?" asked Beatrice, wondering when this long lecture would finally end. "How do you think? She snuck into the enemy camp one night and turned 100 soldiers to stone. It is said that Suleiman the Magnificent, who was personally commanding the siege, was so horrified at what he saw the next morning that he withdrew the entirety of his forces almost immediately, citing a mysterious plague." "Fascinating," said Beatrice, who let a yawn overtake her. The guide's eyes narrowed. "Watch what you say," said Leah, her jovial tone suddenly turning harsh, as if Beatrice had insulted her best friend. "That woman might have saved all of Western Europe. And how was she rewarded by the governing Venetian High Council? By being thrown off the walls of the Angelo Castro for the high crime of witchcraft." The guide turned away for a moment, and Beatrice thought she saw tears welling in her eyes. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean it that way. History was not exactly my favorite subject in school." "It's okay," said Leah, wiping her eyes. "Besides, you'll know her well soon enough." "What?" Leah ignored her and bent down at the far end of the altar and began aggressively digging into the stone wall. "Great, more desecration." "Shh! Save your moral judgments for tomorrow." "Ah, here it is." The tour guide removed her dirt-covered hands from the hole she had created and held up a tiny metal sphere. "What is that?" asked Beatrice. "This," said Leah, "is a bead of orichalcum." "I'm sorry, what?" "Orichalcum," repeated Leah. "An artifact of the lost city of Atlantis. Scholars have debated for centuries whether the beads acted as a power source or imbued the wearer with mystical powers, but they're way off base." "You expect me to believe that not only was Atlantis real, but that you just happened to find one of its leftover magic beads here by chance?" Leah shook her head. "No, but that would be worth an extra star in your voyage guide review that you're going to write later, wouldn't it? The bead I found years ago, this place just makes a good hiding spot because everyone's afraid of the nuns next door for some reason. And yes, Atlantis was real, but that's a story for another day. Here." Leah handed the bead to Beatrice. It was heavy, despite its small size, and the metal was practically ice-cold. "So if it's not a power or magic source, what is it?" "Memories," said Leah. "Through a particular alchemic ritual that is now lost to us, a person's memories and knowledge could be transferred into the bead at or near the time of death. Except the Atlanteans took it a step further and compounded the effect by combining memories from multiple people and multiple generations, which ended up being very useful when the city was destroyed." "And this ties back into the Medoblad because—" "I'm getting there. The Castellan's daughter, Eliana, besides being brave beyond measure in facing the Ottoman army alone, knew what was likely to happen to her even if she succeeded. So, right before her uncle had her captured, Eliana hid the Medoblad, and being a descendant of Atlantis through her mother's line, performed the transfer ritual on herself." "Wow," said Beatrice. Her head was swimming with all the new knowledge Leah was casually tossing around. Atlantis? Memory transference? She had so many questions, but hoped there would be time later for her to extract whatever else the guide knew. "So, we just put this bead in some sort of magic projector, and it will show us where this princess hid the Medoblad?" "Not exactly. You can only access the bead's memories by eating it." Beatrice practically threw the bead back at Leah, But the guide pushed back her outstretched hand. "You're kidding, right?" "Afraid not. Do you want something to drink? It will help wash it down." "What? Oh, no. I'd like to think I've become more of a go-with-the-flow type of person after I learned the truth about magic and alchemy, but this is just ridiculous. There's no way you're going to convince me to swallow this and become some sort of reincarnation of this dead girl. It's not like that. The bead is just her memories, not her essence. Still a hard no." Leah nodded her head slowly. "I figured you would say that. Just know that I do have some unpleasant ways of making you go through with it in my arsenal. But it's probably best if you take on the task without reservations. Go back to your hotel and relax. And we'll reconvene in the morning." The fan in Beatrice's room spun slowly, its white blades contrasting against the aqua-blue ceiling. She could still hear the raucous chatter from the restaurant downstairs, where she had spent much of the evening imbibing copious amounts of table wine in between gulps of fish stew. The exercise had served its purpose of distracting her from the events of the day, and she had probably been a wink and a nod away from the additional distraction of the particularly handsome waiter, but had thought better of it. The bead of orichalcum had never left her person, as she had awkwardly concealed it in the small of her back, where her flowing summer dress wouldn't betray its presence. She now had 2 small red marks from where she had pulled the duct tape free from her skin, but it was a small price to pay for not having to hide it in her undergarments like something reminiscent of a bad spy novel. Leah's words echoed in her mind, preventing Beatrice from drifting off into the welcome embrace of sleep. She still didn't know what to make of the woman. She obviously knew about the underworld of magic, but how she came to that knowledge, whether it was through the quests of New York City or some other avenue, she couldn't say. What was clear, though, was that this whole business of alchemy and magical items went back a lot further in time than Rita Von Ash and her Revolutionary War antics. There was an entire world out there, filled with the fantastical, and Beatrice had only scratched the surface of the surface. She wondered what would happen if she refused Leah's request. Was her threat an idle one? Or would she unleash a magical torrent of pain through Beatrice's body until she gave in? Or worse, did the guide somehow have a vial of Rita's command ink at her disposal? With that, if the diary was to be believed, there would be no stopping Leah from getting what she wanted. Which was still a mystery to Beatrice. Sure, who wouldn't want a magical dagger that could turn someone to stone? But the practicalities of actually using it made it more valuable as a deterrent against a more powerful foe, such as, say, the Guild. Her only run-in with the shadowy organization had been a brief one. A man by the name of Gilbert had accosted her for the secret behind her strength buff. She had lied and made up some story about salamanders, but she knew it was only a matter of time before he and the Guild caught on. And when they did, she wanted to be ready. Beatrice was also having major doubts that even if they somehow plumbed the depths of Eliana's memory and found the lost blade, Leah was just going to let her up and leave the island with the prize. So that thought had added yet another notch in the "don't swallow the magical memory bead" column that she was now tabulating in her head. And the prospect of this woman's memories somehow being injected into her cortex made her stomach retch. She didn't even want to think about what that would feel like. Beatrice had discovered a lot about the world of magic and alchemy since her initiation several years ago, and from what she currently knew, which she admitted was nothing in the grand scheme of things, was that this bead was beyond comprehension. Even the Medoblad and its powers she could get a handle on. Stab someone and turn them to stone. Of course, that was also horrific to consider, but she hoped not to be on the receiving end of that occurrence any time soon. Or ever. The music downstairs suddenly reached a crescendo, and Beatrice covered her head with a pillow to block it out. She wanted to block out everything that had happened on this trip and just go back home and continue on with her life. She could forget about the Medoblad, forget about Atlantis and the tragic story of Eliana, and stockpile her strength gummies until she could withstand anything the Guild could throw at her. But she knew deep down that it wouldn't be enough. The Guild was hundreds of years old, and surely had means of counteracting her alchemy. Beatrice bolted up straight and glared at the Atlantean relic on the table. It reflected the light of the full moon seeping in through the window with an uncanny shimmer, adding to its mystique. She cursed under her breath and slid over to the nightstand to consider the bead further. It was the size of a shelled walnut, and she figured she could swallow it without gagging too much. Then what? Leah hadn't been exactly clear on the details of how the whole memory storage thing worked. The prudent thing to do would be to wait until the morning, which was only several hours away at this point, and wait for further instructions. But fuck prudence. Maybe it was the alcohol talking, but Beatrice had it with the waiting and the uncertainty and the doing what she was told. If she was going to be used as a pawn in whatever game Leah was playing, then it would be on her terms. Beatrice slid off the bed and walked briskly to the mini-fridge embedded in the credenza below the TV on the opposite side of the room. She opened the door and pulled out an overpriced bottle of spring water, unscrewed the light blue cap, and took a sip. The clear liquid was a welcome palate cleanser from the remaining traces of wine, but as she brought the bottle up to her mouth again, she realized she was stalling. She found her feet carrying her body over to the table, and her hand, also seemingly with a mind of its own, grabbed the bead in one fell swoop and brought it to her lips. The metal was cold to the touch, and her sober mind surfaced just for a second, shouting that this thing was wrong in every way and that she should open the sliding glass door and chuck it into the water. A laugh escaped Beatrice's mouth as she subdued her logical self and swallowed the bead whole with a gulp of water. She stood there for a few moments, while nothing particularly noteworthy happened. Maybe the orichalcum was some sort of poison-filled vessel, and Leah's story was nothing but a fanciful tale that she and the guild had cooked up to get rid of her while she was off in some far-flung place. But Beatrice couldn't think such thoughts now, because at the moment, her mind was being beset by a torrent of ancient memories. "You look like shit," said Leah, after Beatrice had finished drinking her third cup of coffee of the morning. The two of them were sitting at the patio outside the hotel restaurant, overlooking the beach and a nice little garden that grew the herbs that had seasoned her stew from the prior night's dinner. Beatrice hadn't grunted more than a few words at both Leah and the waitress in the half hour they had been dining. Her thoughts were occupied elsewhere, trying to hold at bay the deluge of memory she had inserted into her head through that stupid bead, which was, in addition to the brain-scrambling properties already mentioned, giving her a terrible stomachache at the moment. Her shaking hands nearly knocked over the remaining plates on the table as she slowly picked up her coffee mug and tried to signal the waitress for more caffeine. It was then that a look of realization appeared on Leah's face. "No, you didn't," she said, her voice raised slightly. "You wouldn't have been so stupid as to have swallowed the bead by yourself." Beatrice nodded her head slowly and reached down to retrieve one of the green buffs from her bag. Then, with all of her remaining mental strength, she forced the gummy into her mouth. The effects kicked in after a few seconds, and she breathed a sigh of relief. "I did," said Beatrice, smiling meekly. How are you still here?" asked Leah. "The bead, it's so concentrated with memories that a normal person would be buried beneath their weight." "I know, but fortunately I packed wisely for this trip." "What did you just eat?" "I call it a focus buff," Beatrice said. "It's a mixture of prima materia, cot leaves, and some other ingredients I don't care to mention. The important thing is, it's the only thing letting my mind keep the contents of the orichalcum at bay." That wasn't entirely true. There were parts of her memory that now contained vivid recollections of places she had never been, people she had never met, and languages she had never spoken. But there were also, strangely, other sections that weren't as foreign, but they seemed so trivial compared to the others that she had let them fall away. The surge of memories had nearly overwhelmed her within the first minute, but Beatrice Stollard was nothing if not determined, and so she had held herself together, like an acorn bobbing against the currents of a mighty river, until she was able to crawl over to her bag and retrieve the buff. Leah regarded her with a mixture of suspicion and awe before finally letting out a long sigh. Well, this has not exactly gone according to plan. But I suppose there's nothing to do now but go— Wait a minute, said Beatrice, who grabbed Leah's wrist as she tried to get up from the table. How were you going to keep me from drowning in memories? Or were you going to let the bead destroy my sanity just long enough for you to find the blade? Not destroy, said the guide. Just temporarily disable. You'd be conscious and awake, and even retain some of your sparkling personality, but without any sense of who you really were. And when we were done, I would have taken back the bead, and your real self would have resurfaced. Beatrice released her grip, and Leah pulled back her arm. That's why you need me, then. If you just swallowed it, you would be the one who would be consumed. Yes, and I also know what memories we're looking for, so if you're satisfied that I wasn't about to let you waste away into an empty shell, then let's go. They spent the rest of the morning in the black sedan, winding their way slowly up the mountain toward the supposed resting place of the Medoblad, the Angelo Castro, a castle on one of the island's highest peaks. Leah recounted with great detail how the castle had never fallen, and how it had been instrumental in holding off several rounds of Ottoman invasions, including the one where Eliana's heroism had turned the tide. It was also, conveniently, where Eliana had died, and Leah was confident that the bead would reveal where in the mountain stronghold the castellan's daughter had stashed the weapon before she had met her end. Beatrice tried to listen, but it was a bit difficult with the pressure of 1,000 memories pushing against her own in the back of her skull. She ignored the pain, but it would only be a matter of time before she would need to let the dam break and be flooded by Eliana's past. The car pulled to a stop in a small parking lot at the foot of a stone-lined path that disappeared up into the woods. As she stepped out of the car and stared up at the top of the hill that held the remains of the Angelo Castro, Beatrice felt a sharp, stabbing pain shoot through her head. Her vision became blurry, and when she opened her eyes again, after wiping away the tears that had suddenly formed, the sun was gone, the moon was pale, and the castle was magnificent. Fires lit the looming walls, adding to the spectacle, and she felt her body, now draped in unfamiliar fabric, taking the long steps up the hill in 2 strides or fewer. Her breathing was hard, and as she ran, she felt the press of something hard and leathery, and yet also smooth against her thigh. It was then that the force of Leah's palm landed on her cheek. The experience was entirely disorienting, because she could have sworn that she had some urgent business at the castle, but looking up ahead, she saw that it was the daytime. But that couldn't be right, as she had just traveled— "Get a hold of yourself, Smith!" Leah said with a growl, and Beatrice looked up to see the tour guide with a distraught look on her face. What happened? Her face stung from the slap, and she wanted to curse out this woman who had brought nothing but misery and strange, ancient substances into her life, but she held her tongue for the moment. You slipped, drifted into a memory. No, I didn't, said Beatrice. I was running up the steps, and you weren't running anywhere. You had stopped entirely and were standing there like a statue until I brought you back. Oh, but the focus buff shouldn't be wearing off for another hour. Doesn't matter, said Leah. We've come to the place with the most significance for Eliana. She lived here, she died here. Her memories are pushing through the barrier you've put up, and they won't be denied. So what can I do? You trust me. I will guide you up the rest of the mountain. Here. Leah withdrew a red scarf from her bag and handed it to Beatrice. Cut yourself off from the present, and the past won't try to force its way in. My voice will keep you grounded until we reach our destination. Beatrice regarded the would-be blindfold with as much suspicion as one should have after the happenings of the last 24 hours, but it wouldn't do Leah much good to push her off the castle ramparts if the bead hadn't been retrieved first. So she threw the tiny bit of remaining caution to the wind and blinded her deceiving eyes. Step forward, but keep your body taut, said Leah, but her voice was far away for some reason. Beatrice's world for the past hour had been the red fabric pressed against her eyes, and Leah's words. It had worked well enough to keep the memories at bay, but she felt that at any moment she would slip and fall into a bottomless pit, from which there was no return. And now Leah was asking her to do just that. "Where are you?" asked Beatrice. "If I told you, you wouldn't like it. Hurry, before someone sees you." A week ago, she would have laughed at the things she had done in the service of this stranger, but once again she blindly trusted Leah's instructions and took one step forward. As she suspected, there was nothing but empty space in front of her, and she fell through the supposed opening. It could have been 5 seconds or 5 minutes, but eventually Beatrice hit something soft and her body tumbled forward. "Keep your blindfold on, please," said Leah's voice, as Beatrice began to push herself up from whatever had broken her fall. She turned to where she thought the guide was standing and let everything out that she had been holding in. "Okay, but I'm done with the trust walks and the trust falls and the magic memory beads. If you want me to go any further, you need to answer my questions." Her words echoed softly in wherever they were. That was probably a good starting question, she figured. "Where are we, exactly?" "One of the castle's cisterns. It's normally covered by a metal grate so that stupid people like us don't accidentally fall in. From here, we can get to where we need to go." "And that is?" asked Beatrice. "Wherever Eliana hid the Medoblad." "You're sure it's here?" Beatrice knew the answer to that question. She had felt the scabbarded blade rubbing against her side as she ran up the castle pathway. Or rather, she remembered what Eliana had felt on that night so long ago. "Yes, I'm sure. I wouldn't have given you the bead and brought you all the way here if I wasn't absolutely sure." "Okay, but why me? Am I the only one who's come looking for the thing in all this time?" "Oh, most certainly not," said Leah, and Beatrice wished she could see the woman's face. "There were others, and they, well, failed. But I had a good feeling about you, and if there's anything I've learned over the years, it's that I should trust myself more." "That's it? You had a feeling? You don't know a damn thing about me." "But that's where you're wrong, Beatrice Stollard. You're right to be wary about the Guild, by the way. If they consider you an enemy, then you'll need more than the Medoblad to hold them at bay." Leah's utterance of her real last name and her real purpose here made Beatrice nearly fall over. Was this whole thing a setup by Leah from the very beginning? "Who are you? Really?" Beatrice felt Leah's hand suddenly grab her own, and she let herself be led forward into the unknown. "I'm the light in the darkness. Now let's get going. We don't have much time." Leah led her through such a maze of twists and turns that soon Beatrice lost track of time and space. She felt like Theseus braving the depths of the labyrinth, except that he hadn't been blindfolded, and that was on an island several 100 miles to the south. All the while, the pressure in her head kept building until she guessed it was a matter of minutes until the memories would break open the door and dilute her own being to a drop in an ocean. "Are we almost where we need to be?" she asked, after yet another series of sharp turns left her feeling dizzy. "We're close. The underground passages in this castle are extensive. They were designed to let the inhabitants escape if the fortress ever fell. Here we are." The guide stopped, and Beatrice collided into her back, the red scarf finally falling free from her eyes. They were in a dimly lit chamber, with faded frescoes painted on the walls that matched the hue of the water outside her hotel, and an opening in the opposite wall. She looked around the room for the source of the light, and found it in Leah's hands, a small red rock that was emitting a strange glow. Ordinarily, she would have inquired about the seemingly magical object, but she had more pressing concerns to worry about. "What is this place?" asked Beatrice. "This," said Leah, "was Eliana's study. She painted the walls herself. You can imagine what they would have looked like in her time." "I don't need to imagine," said Beatrice. "I can see them in all their former glory. It's like the room is flickering to life." "Then it's about to happen. There's only so much I can guide you after it does. If this is going to work, then you need to hold enough of yourself together so that you can follow Eliana's path, so that you're not just a bystander viewing the past. Okay, I can do that. Beatrice wasn't sure if that was true, but she could make it the truth if she believed it strongly enough. She took a deep breath, closed her eyes, and then opened them again. The brightly painted walls nearly overwhelmed her at first, but she didn't have time to marvel at their beauty as the memory began to dictate what she saw and where she went. When Eliana turned to face the other wall, Beatrice saw a small table and chair in one corner of the room. Eliana walked to the nook and picked up the quill that rested next to a vial of ink and an open book. The page was filled with crisply written letters, interspersed with diagrams and drawings. There was a sketch of the human body that reminded Beatrice of Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, except this one was of a woman, and it had several additional markings, a circle at the center of the forehead and one on each wrist, with a set of lines connecting the three in a triangle. The words dotting the page were all in Italian, but despite not knowing the language other than a few stereotypical phrases, Beatrice found she could understand what was written. The Rituals of the Three, the top of the page said. Mastery of the three elements of being was the long-desired goal of the ancient powers. Atlantis mastered the first, memory, while... The word was so foreign to Beatrice that she couldn't make heads or tails of it. Squabbled over whether their efforts should be spent perfecting their stones to hold essence or body. Avalon concerned itself with none of the three pursuits. I have studied extensively the possibility that... Essence. Why did that word sound familiar, Beatrice wondered. But before she could examine the page any further, Eliana had closed the book with a thud and began walking to the opposite end of the chamber where a door that wasn't there in the present blocked the way. With one hand, Eliana slowly turned the knob and pushed the door forward, while the other she brought to her neck and began rubbing something. It was the same bead of orichalcum that was now somewhere inside Beatrice. A whisper suddenly permeated the memory, but Eliana paid it no mind. "You're doing it," the faint voice said. "Keep going." Beatrice imagined that her actual head nodded in response to Leah's words, and concentrated on merging her actions with those of the Castellan's daughter. The memory continued, and they journeyed through an intricate series of corridors beyond the study. It was one of the strangest experiences of Beatrice's life. She felt like a ghost haunting the halls of an old mansion, afoot in two different worlds. If she had any spare mental capacity to focus on the sensation, she might have collapsed under the weight of everything. But as it was, the current task was slowly eating away at the remaining vestiges of her sanity, and she hoped that they reached their destination soon. Thankfully, it soon appeared ahead, a solitary door at the end of the long hallway. Eliana slowed her gait and retrieved the Medoblad from underneath her trousers, but before she opened the door, something odd happened. Beatrice's field of vision began to shake and blur, and she feared that she was being yanked out of the memory when she only needed to hold on a tiny bit more. But then the world steadied and she let out a sigh of relief. It was only temporary, though, because when Eliana resumed her trek forward, Beatrice was standing there in the hallway, looking at the back of the woman she had previously been joined with. "Why is this happening?" Beatrice heard herself say, before cupping her mouth with her hands, but it was too late, as Eliana turned around to face her. "What are you doing here?" The two women faced each other across time. Eliana had dark brown hair that was hidden mostly beneath a piece of linen tied around her ears, and tan skin that reminded Beatrice of the local women she had seen bathing all day on the beach abutting her hotel. Her face was a mixture of sadness and fear, the former because of her impending fate, and the latter from the likely discovery of the interloper in her memory. "You can see me?" said Beatrice in English. "Yes," said Eliana in Italian, but both women somehow understood each other. "Who are you? And what are you doing here?" "This is just a memory." How are you talking to me?
Just a memory. Who told you that?
The woman who gave me the orichalcum, the same bead that's around your neck.
I see. During the ordinary memory ritual, it is not possible for the other aspects to be absorbed. However, I devised a different way, as you may have seen in my diary.
The door's locked, Leah called out from somewhere.
We can't go any farther.
Shh, said Beatrice aloud to the not-visible tour guide.
Something's happened. Is that her? The woman who found me?
Beatrice nodded.
So, she's back. Do you trust her?
I don't know. I'm not in the habit of trusting people to begin with.
A good quality, some would say. I too only trusted myself and my own abilities, but I still ended up here.
You cheated death. How is that a bad thing?
I cheated nothing. I will die this night. When the ritual is finished, I will be arrested by guards doing the bidding of my uncle. Even though I saved everyone, he will cast my heroics as the work of the devil and have me thrown from the walls of my home, which he will take from my father, too. This last piece of my essence, it is to safeguard the location of my greatest treasures, the Medoblad, and my research. Tell me, which is it you have come here seeking?
The former, so I can fight back against those more powerful than me.
And how will the blade let you do that? Will you turn all your enemies to stone and smash their corpses to pieces? Will that give you the peace you seek?
I don't know. But everything I've done so far will amount to nothing if I don't do something.
You act out of desperation, out of a desire to save only yourself. Such a person will never be worthy to wield the relic. It was a waste for her to bring you here.
No, Beatrice shouted. You don't know what I've been through to get here. How much those I've loved have suffered because I wasn't strong enough to protect them. She opened her mind to Eliana, and everything poured out. All of her pain and loss, all of her ambition and resilience, all of her being she laid bare. If it was not enough, then so be it. But she would hold nothing back. Time stood still as the castellan's daughter considered Beatrice's offering, like Anubis weighing the heart of someone seeking entrance to the field of reeds, and eventually a small smile escaped her lips.
Very well. It seems I was mistaken. But do not think I will hand over the blade to you only because of that. You will still have to earn it.
Eliana opened the door and disappeared into the darkness behind it. But when Beatrice went to follow, it shut again with such force that she nearly toppled over. As she waited at the precipice, she could hear Leah's voice back in the real world, pleading with Beatrice to keep going, but she ignored it. This was her trial, and she would bear it however long it took. Finally, the door creaked open and Eliana emerged, the Medoblad conspicuously absent from her hand.
It is done. Now your final test will begin. Go forth and claim the Gorgon's blade, if you can find the diamond in the rough.
With that, Eliana pushed the startled Beatrice into the blackness beyond. The room was not dark. That was odd, thought Beatrice, but the answer to her confusion soon revealed itself in the form of dozens of small slits cut into the rock walls that allowed enough sunlight to creep into the chamber. The second thing that was odd was that Leah was standing in the room next to her, and Beatrice could only conclude that Eliana had somehow pushed her out of the memory. She still felt the familiar pressure of the orichalcum in her mind, but even though the focus buff had long since worn off, the memories were being kept at bay for the moment. The third thing that was odd was that the walls of the room were filled with daggers. From floor to ceiling, the rusted weapons were suspended on metal hooks, and each looked exactly like the Medoblad. "You're seeing all this, right?" Beatrice said to Leah, who nodded in response. "Yes, but how did you finally open the door? What do you mean, finally?"
We've been standing in front of that door for 6 hours. This light that's illuminating the room, it's from the sun setting. I was about to forcibly remove the bead from you when you—
"Oh," said Beatrice. The light of the setting sun was suddenly transformed into a dazzling array of colors by the exposed blades. It was almost blinding, and Beatrice figured that was Eliana's intention. "What now?" asked Leah, who had made several circles around the chamber before coming back to the entrance. "No clue," said Beatrice. "We've gotten this far because of you. Don't tell me you're all out of ideas now."
Okay, I won't, said Leah.
Don't suppose we could just take down all the knives and figure out which one is the real one later? Really? Haven't you been in an ancient chamber full of treasure before? If we grab the wrong one, the knives will probably rotate to point at us and the walls will close in. You've seen too many movies. The real world doesn't work that way, the guide said. Oh, you're right, said Beatrice. In the real world, magic actually exists. So it's probably something much more terrifying than being slowly stabbed to death. A muffled pecking noise echoed in the room, most likely from one of the song thrushes she had seen in her time on the island. Great. And now we have a ticking clock to aid in our deliberations. Go back into the memory, said Leah. Eliana will help you. No, she's helped enough. This last step, it's up to me alone. Beatrice walked to the middle of the chamber. She wanted to believe that she was wrong, that if she pushed hard enough, Eliana's hiding place would burst forth from the wall, the promised diamond in the rough. But there was no diamond to be found, just dozens of sparkling daggers. The thought gave Beatrice an idea. She spun around slowly the first time the room turned into a dazzling light show, one that only became more brilliant the faster she twirled. The fourth rotation, she thought she saw it, and by the seventh, she was almost positive. Leah was yelling something, but Beatrice didn't care. She needed to keep going. Just once more around, and she would find the rough in the diamond. She closed her eyes as her feet did their dance, and the shining knives fought to pierce the darkness. All but one. Beatrice opened her eyes, the dizziness a trifling concern because all she had to do was take 3 steps forward and pull the one knife in the room that refused to return the sun's light. Her fingers grasped the ivory handle she pulled with all her might. There's no need for that, said Eliana, suddenly beside her. It is yours now, keeper. The Medoblad came free from the wall, and Beatrice felt its power pulsing through her as if her heart and the weapon were one. And then, without warning, the chamber vanished. She was back in the study, back looking out into the world from Eliana's eyes. Except this time she wasn't alone. There was another woman in the room, garbed in long pants and a flowing blouse. The newcomer had her back to Eliana, and was bent over a large chest, frantically searching for something. You have returned, said the woman in an oddly familiar voice. Are you ready, then, to perform the rituals? Eliana yanked the orichalcum free from the middle of her necklace, the other beads cascading onto the stone floor. She then walked to her notebook, tore out the page that Beatrice had read earlier, and fed it to one of the candles that lit the room. The other woman didn't seem to notice this wanton destruction of what Beatrice could only speculate was priceless knowledge. Instead, she continued digging through the seemingly bottomless chest, until at last she lifted a gleaming longsword and turned around to face the combined Eliana and Beatrice. Yes, Alia, said Eliana to the woman who bore Leah's face. I am ready. Beatrice woke up in a cold sweat. The study, the castle, the vision of Eliana, and improbably Leah, they were gone, but not the orichalcum. She tried to sit up in her hotel bed, but her body wouldn't respond, and from her reclined vantage, she could just make out the sliver of the moon shining dimly outside her window, which gave her pause. Are you finally awake? Said someone sitting in the dark corner by the bathroom. The words were Italian, but Beatrice couldn't understand them. Leah? she said with uncontrolled trepidation. "What's going on?"
"So, no," said the guide in English, emerging from the shadows. "You're not. It's just the vessel."
"I don't understand," said Beatrice. You were there in the memory. She called you Aaliyah." Leah walked slowly to the end of the bed, the Medoblad gripped tightly in her right hand.
"She showed you, did she?"
said Leah.
"You must have made quite the impression on her. Who would have thought?"
"You knew, then, that the bead isn't just memories, that there's a part of Eliana's essence still in here." The woman pointed the knife with shaking hands at the frozen Beatrice, and for a second she thought Leah would plunge the weapon right into her heart.
"It wasn't supposed to be that way,"
Leah said, her words coming out in small sobs.
"She had deduced the essence ritual, the one that the Atlanteans, even with their combined knowledge, had never figured out. She knew what would happen if she used the Medoblad so brazenly, but she convinced me it was the only way to save the island, and I let her go. She told me that it would be okay, that a body was just a container, and that with her essence and her memories intact, she could live on, truly in the body of another."
"But she lied to you," said Beatrice. "She only put enough of herself in the bead to guard her secrets."
"That's correct,"
said Leah, finally regathering her composure.
"It was an unwelcome surprise when I put the orichalcum into one of the villagers a few weeks later, only to watch as the woman's mind was instantly overwhelmed and crushed by the memories without a trace of Eliana to be found."
"And then you ate the bead yourself," said Beatrice, the feeling in her muscles returning enough to allow her to prop herself up in the bed. "But of course Eliana would never give up the secret to you, would she?" Leah advanced another few steps forward, her eyes filled with anger, and Beatrice realized she was powerless to do anything to stop the inevitable.
"Shut your mouth, before I shut it forever."
"Aaliyah," said a voice from Beatrice's mouth, but it wasn't hers. "Enough." Aaliyah or Leah, or whoever the guide really was, dropped the Medoblad, and it fell unceremoniously to the ground.
"Eliana?"
asked Leah.
"Why? Why did you do it? You could have lived on with me. We would have been happy."
It was the oddest sensation. Beatrice felt like she was back in one of the memories of the bead, watching someone else's life. Except somehow, the remaining little piece of Eliana had pushed aside Beatrice and grabbed control of her body. "Are you sure?" said Eliana, fully taking control of Beatrice's body and sliding slowly down the bed to Leah. "Would you have felt the same way about me in a new body? And then what would have happened? When that one withered and you did not, would you make me change hosts again? And again after that? This was the true reason my ancestors did not seek the other rituals, as I foolishly did."
We would have found another way."
"No, it is hard enough for your kind to change as it is, without me there also providing the warm comfort of familiarity that would have kept you stagnant. And I thought you had moved on when you finally hid the bead. Why did you come back?" Leah grabbed Beatrice's hand, but even that sensation she couldn't feel. She wondered how much of Eliana was left in the bead, and whether the woman would really return her body back to her when this was over.
"I did move on. Many times. I didn't want to come back here, but recent events forced my hand. And then I found this one, who had discovered the breadcrumbs I had left over the years. I wanted to see if she was worthy of the relic, if she would support our side in the war to come."
"She's worthy, but she fights only for herself. I think that will change. You would do well to keep an eye on her until she is ready." In the depths of her own mind, Beatrice was shouting at the other woman, but to no avail. She wanted to know more. About the rituals, about Leah, about everything. But Eliana's essence remained in firm control.
"I'll try,"
said Leah, who brought the back of Beatrice's hand up to her mouth and gave it a gentle kiss. "Thank you, cuore mio," said Eliana, and a tiny smile appeared on Leah's face. "And now I need to leave you again, while there is still some of me left." Beatrice saw her own eyes close, and a hazy figure then appeared in front of her in her mindscape. "Beatrice," said Eliana, "do not make me regret my decision." "I won't," said Beatrice, "but I have so many questions. What—" Eliana held up her hand and shook her head side to side. "And I am afraid there will be no answers today. You still have much to learn, much to discover. I will leave you with the Medoblad, but your memories of Aaliyah and of me, those the orichalcum will take as payment." "What? No, you can't do that. I need to know—" Beatrice felt a stinging sensation as silvery strands of memory were pulled from her mind and into Eliana's outstretched hand, where they were drawn into a tiny bead that she then offered up to the giant, glowing orichalcum that shone overhead like a metal moon. When the last thread had been torn free, the specter of the castellan's daughter opened her other hand, where a similar but golden-colored ball was waiting. It unwound itself into thin tendrils that snaked their way into the fresh gaps in Beatrice's memory and settled in like a bird discovering a newly abandoned nest. She fought against these intrusions, tried to form a barrier to block their entry, but that quickly failed. She could see the mindscape collapsing all around her, the orichalcum ready to force its way out of her, and with a last-ditch effort, Beatrice formed a single thought in her head that the gold was fake. "Clever," said Eliana, pulling forth the new thought and crushing it with her palm, "but futile. I leave you now, and trust that you will find your way. Farewell, alchemist." The woman faded into mist, and it was then that the orichalcum came crashing down from its perch in the sky of her mind. And the next thing she knew, Beatrice was head down in a garbage can behind the bar of the hotel restaurant, vomiting her guts out. It was morning, and a woman with curly brown hair and several gold chains around her neck was standing over her, a look of concern on her face. Beatrice pushed herself up from the ground, ignoring both the woman and the glint of metal at the bottom of the pail, and walked back to her table on the restaurant patio. Her new friend, however, was persistent, and soon sat down across from her. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I was eating next to you, and you sprinted away so suddenly that I thought you were possessed." "I'm fine," said Beatrice, her bearings returning to her slowly. She was, in fact, not fine. Far from it. This morning was supposed to be her moment of triumph, but instead she felt like absolute shit. Her last 2 weeks of searching had improbably borne fruit the previous night when she had discovered the Medoblad buried in the stones of the altar at the Temple of Artemis. She had been there 4 times already, but for some reason she had decided that maybe the simplest solution was the most likely one, and so she had dug up the ancient site with the aid of an imperfect strength buff and had been handsomely rewarded for her efforts when she had pulled the ivory-handled blade free from the rubble. But no sooner had she retreated into an alleyway behind the neighboring monastery was she attacked by a shadowy, cloaked figure. It was almost ridiculous in a way, like a script out of a bad movie. Who the man was, Beatrice never found out because he didn't bother introducing himself. Instead, he'd immediately resorted to violence. His punch to her stomach hadn't fazed her in the slightest. She was still running on the last dregs of the buff, after all, but she knew that her opportunity to counter him was rapidly diminishing. She hadn't wanted to use the Medoblad. Hell, she wasn't necessarily convinced that it was the real thing. Her options had been limited, though, and if the strength buff had run out before she dealt with him, the rebound would leave her ripe for the picking. So before the attacker could strike again, Beatrice had plunged the would-be Medoblad into his right arm. She had been as shocked as the man when the stone had sprouted from the wound, so much so that she had yanked the knife out immediately, lest it somehow reverse course and transfer the curse to herself. But the stone had halted at the crook of her attacker's elbow, and Beatrice, with her last ounce of super strength, had shattered it like it was a delicate ice sculpture. The man had turned and fled, which was good, because a moment later she had blacked out. Beatrice now surveyed the breakfast in front of her, And despite the rawness in her throat and the pounding in her head, she devoured it as if she hadn't eaten in days. The annoying woman remained seated across from her, and finally, after she had finished the last bit of eggs and downed her 4th espresso shot, she acknowledged her again. "You can go now, lady. I told you I was fine." "Okay," said the woman, who got up without another word and walked away. A sudden feeling of déjà vu crept over Beatrice, but she pushed it aside, along with the rest of her current ailments, and tried to bask in the glow of her accomplishment. She had, despite all the seemingly impossible obstacles, recovered an ancient weapon brimming with unimaginable power. Power that would let her move forward again, conquer the raid board, train an army of disciples, and finally confront Gilbert and the guild. Beatrice pushed back from the table and was about to head down to the beach for some well-deserved relaxation when she noticed a piece of paper under the empty water glass where the mysterious woman had been sitting. It was trying to catch the morning breeze and fly away, but before it could, she snatched it, turning it over to find a single handwritten question. If I am only for myself, who am I? Guild of Tokens, Relic Hunter, was written by John Auerbach and read by Tavia Gilbert. Editing and post-production by Katie Flood.